I told you the Bible contains a footnote to a story so shocking, they had to erase the original book. You've likely read the Bible, or at least heard its stories. But there's a single verse tucked away in the short book of Jude that acts as a reference to a lost record. It's a fleeting glimpse into a cosmic showdown, a legal battle between heaven's greatest warrior and the Prince of Darkness himself. The verse describes the Archangel Michael arguing with Lucifer over the body of Moses. This immediately raises questions. Why would anyone, let alone these two cosmic powers, fight over a corpse? And why would Michael, a being of immense power, only say, "The Lord rebuke you"? These are the obvious questions. But they are not the most important one. The real mystery, the secret that unlocks everything, is not just what happened, but where the author of Jude learned about this event in the first place. This verse isn't the story. It's a fingerprint left at the scene, a citation to a file that has gone missing from the official archive. For centuries, this clue has been hiding in plain sight, pointing to a much older, more detailed account that tells us what Michael really did to Lucifer. An account that details the secret of Moses' body, explaining the devil's legal claim and the archangel's brilliant defense. An account that was ultimately erased. Tonight, we are not just rereading a familiar verse. We are reopening a cold case. We are going to find that missing file and read the page they tore out. The question we left hanging wasn't about the battle, but about the clue itself. If Jude 1:9 is the fingerprint, where is the rest of the evidence? Where is the original case file that this single sentence is referencing? For nearly 2,000 years, that file has been sealed, deemed too controversial for the main collection. But it was never truly destroyed. The answer lies in a document that has been whispering from the margins of history for millennia. It is known as the Assumption of Moses. This ancient Jewish text, believed to have been written in the 1st century, but containing traditions far older, is a masterpiece of what scholars call pseudepigrapha. Think of these not as forgeries, but as the silenced witnesses of history. They are ancient writings attributed to legendary biblical figures, in this case, Moses himself. In the time of Jesus and the apostles, these books were widely read, fiercely debated, and deeply respected. They filled in the gaps and provided the crucial context that the more streamlined official accounts left out. When the author of Jude wrote his letter, he wasn't sharing a private vision. He was quoting from a source he expected his audience to recognize, a story that was part of their shared understanding of the spiritual world. So why isn't the Assumption of Moses in your Bible today? Because at a certain point in history, the gatekeepers of tradition decided which books would make the final cut. They drew a line in the sand, and texts like this one, with their vivid depictions of the spiritual realm and their complex theological arguments, were left on the other side. They weren't necessarily deemed false, but perhaps too raw, too detailed, too explosive for a standardized canon. They were filed away, becoming the hidden lore of the faith. But within this very text lies the unedited scene of Michael's confrontation with Lucifer. The Assumption of Moses doesn't just confirm that the battle happened. It takes us into the courtroom. It records, in chilling detail, the legal arguments Satan presented. He didn't just demand the body, he filed a claim, citing his authority as the master of the material world and accusing Moses of a crime that, in his eyes, made the prophet's body forfeit. This was not a brawl. It was a legal proceeding at the highest level, a fight over jurisdiction, sin, and the very authority of God over his creation. This erased record turns a simple dispute into a profound revelation about the unseen laws that govern the cosmos. So, what exactly was Satan's case? What damning evidence did he present against Moses that made him believe he had the right to claim the body of God's chosen servant? The answer is more shocking and legally intricate than you can imagine. To understand what Michael really did, we must first listen to the devil's argument for ourselves, an argument preserved only in this forgotten scroll. We have now opened the sealed document. The assumption of Moses lies before us, and the scene it paints is far more chilling than a simple argument. This was not a chaotic shouting match. It was a formal, legal proceeding. Imagine a cosmic courtroom convened in that lonely valley in Moab. Michael, the Archangel, stood as the defense, and stepping forward as the prosecutor was Lucifer himself, armed not with fire and brimstone, but with a meticulously crafted legal indictment. His case was built on two powerful pillars, each one designed to use God's own laws against him. Satan's first claim was breathtaking in its audacity. He presented himself as the master of matter, the lord of the physical world. In his view, since his fall, dominion over the material realm, over dust and decay, had been ceded to him. He was, in essence, the landlord of all that is corruptible. When Moses' spirit returned to God, his body, now lifeless clay, remained. Satan argued that this body was now simply matter, and as the prince of this world, he had come to collect his property. Every death, in his twisted legal framework, was a repossession. Every grave was another parcel of land in his ever-expanding kingdom. He wasn't just trying to snatch a prophet's body. He was attempting to enforce a fundamental principle of his dominion over all of creation. He was telling the heavens, "This part of your creation is mine by right." But his masterstroke, the argument he delivered with venomous precision, was far more personal. He reached back through the decades of Moses' life, past the miracles and the glory, all the way back to the hot sands of Egypt. He pointed an accusing finger at the still form of the prophet and declared, "This man is a murderer." The heavens were reminded of the day Moses, in a flash of anger, struck down an Egyptian taskmaster and buried his body in the sand. This hand, Satan would have argued, is stained with blood. This body was used as an instrument of violence. Do you see the terrifying genius of his strategy? He was leveraging God's own perfect justice. His argument was a legal trap. "By your own holy law," he proclaimed, "a murderer cannot be glorified. This soul may be redeemed by your mercy, but the body, the very tool that committed the sin, is forfeit. It is tainted. It belongs to me." He was creating a paradox. If God were to honor and glorify the body of a man who had taken a life, Satan could accuse the Almighty of being unjust, of violating his own righteous standards. But if God were to surrender the body, it would be a monumental victory for the accuser, a public acknowledgement of his claim over the fallen state of humanity. Satan believed he had cornered God. He presented a case that seemed ironclad, built upon the twin foundations of his domain over matter and God's own perfect law. The accusation hung heavy in the spiritual realm, a silence that awaited a verdict. He believed he had already won. Satan's legal case was brilliant, but it was a smokescreen. His true objective wasn't simply to win a cosmic lawsuit or to claim a piece of dust. His goal was far more insidious, rooted in a deep understanding of human weakness. He wasn't interested in the body for its past, but for its future. He wanted to turn the body of Moses into the most powerful idol the world had ever known. To understand this strategy, we must remember who Moses was to the people of Israel. He wasn't just a leader, he was a living legend, the conduit for God's law, the man who spoke to the Almighty face to face. His staff had parted the Red Sea. His hands had been held up to win battles. In the hearts and minds of the Israelites, Moses was the physical embodiment of God's power and deliverance. Imagine if Satan had succeeded in his claim. Imagine if, weeks or months after God had secretly buried him, the body of Moses miraculously appeared on a mountaintop, perfectly preserved, incorruptible. The news would have spread like wildfire. It would have become the ultimate holy site, a tangible object for a people desperate for something to see and touch. They would have flocked to it by the thousands, seeking healing, guidance, and miracles. They would have prayed to the remains of Moses, not to the God of Moses. The great lawgiver would have become, in death, the greatest stumbling block, a replacement for the very God he served. This wasn't a new strategy. It was a play ripped directly from his old handbook, a tactic he had successfully deployed before. We only need to look back to the infamous incident of the golden calf. While Moses was on Mount Sinai, communing with God to receive the 10 Commandments, the people below grew restless. Their faith faltered. They demanded a visible God they could worship, and they melted down their gold to forge an idol. Satan knew this weakness intimately. He saw firsthand that if a lifeless statue of a calf could so easily command their devotion, what devastating effect would the actual, preserved body of their greatest hero have? It would be a spiritual catastrophe, cementing idolatry at the very heart of the nation. This reveals the enemy's most dangerous and enduring method of attack. He doesn't always introduce overt evil. His most cunning work is done by corrupting what is good. He takes a blessing from God, a great leader, a powerful spiritual experience, a sacred tradition, and subtly twists it until it becomes the ultimate thing. He encourages us to worship the gift instead of the giver, to revere the messenger more than the one who sent the message. What are the bodies of Moses in our own lives? A charismatic pastor, a particular doctrine, a past revival, a political ideology. These are all potentially good things, but the moment they become the object of our ultimate trust, the moment we look to them for the salvation and security that only God can provide, they become an idol. Satan's strategy has never changed. Find what God has blessed and turn it into a barrier that blocks access to God Himself. So the stage was set. Satan had a brilliant legal case to acquire the means for his devastating plan. He intended to lead an entire nation into apostasy, not by force, but by a twisted form of reverence. He had accounted for everything except the being sent to oppose him. He expected a fight of power against power, a clash of wills that mirrored his own pride. He was not prepared for the shocking simplicity of Michael's defense, a response that would not only neutralize his legal claims, but dismantle his entire philosophy of rebellion. The Archangel was about to speak, and his words would change the rules of the game. Satan's case was made. His arguments, built on the law of matter and the law of justice, hung heavy in the spiritual realm. He stood as the accuser, confident that he had trapped the heavens in a paradox of their own making. He awaited a counter-argument, a legal rebuttal, a debate over the finer points of Moses' life and the sin he had committed. He expected Michael to defend the prophet's honor, to dispute his claim over the physical world, or perhaps to argue that Moses' good deeds outweighed his transgressions. But Michael did none of that. The Archangel's response was a masterclass in spiritual warfare, and it began with a profound act of refusal. He refused to step into the courtroom that Satan had constructed. He refused to engage with the enemy on his own terms. He did not argue about who owned the dust of the earth, for that was a debate rooted in a fallen world's logic. He did not offer excuses for Moses' past, nor did he attempt to downplay the gravity of taking a human life. To argue any of these points would have been to legitimize Satan's position as a valid prosecutor, to acknowledge that he had a right to bring the case in the first place. Michael's strategy was to deny him that legitimacy entirely. Instead, the Archangel's defense was aimed not at the evidence, but at the prosecutor himself. His entire response was a challenge to Satan's jurisdiction. It was a declaration that Satan, a fallen and rebellious creature, had no standing to stand in judgment over a servant of the Most High, no matter their past sins. It was the cosmic equivalent of a lawyer standing before a corrupt judge and stating, "This court has no authority here. The prosecutor has no right to bring these charges." Michael wasn't arguing the facts of the case. He was dismissing the case, the court, and the prosecutor in a single, decisive maneuver. And he accomplished this entire, devastating legal action with one short sentence, a phrase so potent it has echoed through eternity. The Assumption of Moses records that Michael, looking at the Prince of Darkness, did not dare to bring a railing accusation of his own, but simply said, "The Lord rebuke you." Let us be absolutely clear. This was not a desperate plea or a magical incantation. It was a profound legal and spiritual declaration of authority. By saying, "The Lord rebuke you," Michael was doing several things at once. First, he was demonstrating perfect humility and acknowledging the one true source of all power in the universe. Even he, the commander of heaven's armies, operated solely under God's divine command. Second, and most critically, he was formally transferring the case to a higher court. He was taking the file from his own hands and placing it directly into the hands of the ultimate judge. He was effectively saying, "You have made your accusation, but you have made it in the wrong court and to the wrong officer. Your complaint is with my king. He, and he alone, will issue the verdict and the sentence for your insolence." This response completely dismantled Satan's strategy. It rendered his carefully constructed legal arguments about matter and murder irrelevant. The points no longer mattered because the court was no longer in session. Michael refused to be drawn into a debate about the rules of the fallen world. Instead, he appealed to the absolute authority of the divine world, an authority against which Satan has no defense and no standing. It was a checkmate not of logic, but of jurisdiction. This principle is the key to the entire battle. But it also raises an unsettling question. If this detailed account, this incredible lesson in spiritual authority, was known to the early writers of the faith, why was it left behind? Why was the story condensed to a single verse, while the source that contained its rich, strategic detail was allowed to fade into obscurity? The answer reveals an uncomfortable truth about how history is written, and why some truths were considered too untamable for the final pages of the Holy Book. Michael's defense was a masterstroke of spiritual law, a principle so profound it should be foundational to our faith. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. If this detailed account, this incredible lesson in divine authority, was so important that even a New Testament author quoted it as fact, why was it erased from the record? Why are we unearthing it today like a lost artifact instead of reading it in Sunday school? The answer is not a simple conspiracy, but a complex and human one. It lies in the process of how the Bible, as we know it, was assembled. Centuries after the time of Christ and the apostles, councils of church elders and scholars convened to make monumental decisions. These were the gatekeepers of doctrine. Their task was to sort through a vast collection of sacred writings, histories, prophecies, letters, and gospels, and decide which texts would be included in the final official canon. Their motives were often sincere. In a world without printing presses, where texts were rare and literacy was rarer, they sought to create a clear, unified, and accessible message. They wanted to build a safe theological harbor for a rapidly expanding and often persecuted faith. But in the quest for clarity and safety, some truths were deemed too wild, too complex, too untamable to be let inside. The assumption of Moses was one such truth. It presented a spiritual reality that wasn't neat and tidy. It portrayed a Satan who was not merely a monstrous tempter lurking in the shadows, but a brilliant legal mind, a celestial prosecutor capable of building a case against God's chosen prophet using God's own perfect law. This was a dangerous and complicated idea for a young church. It was far simpler, and perhaps safer, to teach of a devil who was a straightforward embodiment of evil, rather than an intelligent adversary who understood scripture and jurisdiction. The story revealed a level of cosmic conflict and legal maneuvering that could be deeply unsettling. Furthermore, its very existence complicated the neat lines the councils were trying to draw. Here was a book, not officially part of their proposed Old Testament, being quoted as an authority by a New Testament writer. To fully embrace it would be to acknowledge a wider, messier, and more mysterious body of sacred literature. It was easier to keep the reference in Jude, a cryptic nod to those in the know, but to let the source text itself fade into obscurity. And so a decision was made. Not always out of malice, but out of a desire for control and simplicity. The story was censored, not by blacking out lines, but by the strategic omission of the entire book. It was left on the cutting room floor of history because its raw truth didn't fit the final edit. The gatekeepers chose a simpler narrative. They gave us the summary in Jude, but they hid the full, unedited report. This is why so many of us have read the Bible and felt that something was missing. It is because things are missing. We have been handed an abridged version of the cosmic drama, a version edited for our protection and for simplicity. But for those of us who are not content with the simplified story, for those of us who are spiritual archaeologists at heart, the clues left behind are all we need to start digging. This process of simplification didn't just affect the stories we were told. It affected the characters within them. And no character has been more simplified and misunderstood than the accuser himself. In our community, a sharp-eyed viewer asked a brilliant question. Why is Lucifer always shown as a hideous monster when the original texts describe him as a being of breathtaking beauty? The answer to that question reveals another layer of censorship, another truth that was deemed too complex for us to handle. The process of historical simplification didn't just sideline entire books. It also flattened the characters within them, turning complex beings into one-dimensional caricatures. This brings us to a brilliant question raised by one of you. If the original texts describe Lucifer as a being of immense beauty, why do we almost always picture him as a hideous, horned monster? The question is a sharp one, and the answer cuts to the very heart of how a difficult truth can be distorted over time into a more convenient lie. The image of a red-skinned demon with a goat's head, bat wings, and a pitchfork is burned into our collective imagination. We see it in medieval paintings, in movies, in cartoons. It is the definitive, universally recognized face of evil. But it is crucial to understand that this image is not biblical. It is a cultural invention, a composite caricature drawn from pagan deities, folklore, and epic poems like Dante's Inferno. It was a useful symbol, a simple way to make the concept of absolute evil instantly recognizable to a largely illiterate population. But in creating this monster, the original, far more terrifying and tragic truth of Lucifer's nature was lost. To find the original portrait, we must turn back to the scrolls of the prophets, to the words they recorded thousands of years ago. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28, God speaks of the king of Tyre. but the language quickly elevates to describe a supernatural being operating behind him, a being of unimaginable splendor. The text says of him, "You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty." It goes on to describe him as having been in Eden, the garden of God, adorned with every precious stone imaginable: sardius, topaz and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper. He is called the Anointed Cherub Who Covers, a title suggesting a guardian of the highest possible status, an archangel whose very presence may have shielded the throne of God. This is not a monster. This is a masterpiece, the pinnacle of God's creation, a being radiating light, wisdom, and a beauty so profound it was considered perfect. But the same passage that describes his perfection also records his fall. It says, "Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor." His downfall was not an external force. It was a cancer that grew from within. His own magnificence became a snare. His beauty, a source of all-consuming pride. His wisdom, a tool for rebellion. The prophet Isaiah paints a similar picture in chapter 14, describing his casting down from the heavens. "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning." The name itself, Lucifer, means light bringer or morning star. He was not created as a creature of darkness. He was created to be the brightest light in the sky, who, in his pride, sought to exalt his own throne above the stars of God. So when we piece together these original records, the image that emerges is not of a monster, but of a tragedy. The true horror of Lucifer is not that he is ugly, but that he was the most beautiful and brilliant of all creations and willingly chose to corrupt that perfection. The monster is not what he looks like, but what he became. A simplistic, horned beast is easy to dismiss. A beautiful, wise, powerful, and utterly proud fallen archangel is a far more subtle, seductive, and dangerous adversary. Understanding this original portrait is essential because it helps us understand the nature of the enemy Michael faced in that valley. Not a mindless beast, but a being of immense intellect and former glory, driven by an all-consuming pride. It was this being, this fallen star, that Michael confronted. And this brings us back to the heart of their dispute. We've seen Satan's legal case and Michael's authoritative response. But what does that response, "The Lord rebuke you," truly mean for us? Is it a weapon for us to wield, as many believe? Or is it something else entirely? The interpretation of this single phrase is a point of major controversy, and it reveals two vastly different paths in spiritual warfare. We now understand the true nature of the adversary Michael faced. Not a monster, but a fallen masterpiece of wisdom and beauty, consumed by pride. This brings us back to the pivotal moment of their confrontation and the 5 words that ended it. "The Lord rebuke you." For centuries, this phrase has been widely interpreted in a very specific way, shaping how many approach spiritual warfare. But is that popular interpretation the correct one? Or does it, like so many other things, hide a much deeper, more challenging truth about our role in the cosmic conflict? The most common understanding, the one taught in many circles, is that this phrase is a weapon. It's seen as a divine formula, a spiritual silver bullet that we, as believers, can and should use when we feel under attack. In this view, when Michael spoke these words, he was actively deploying a power delegated to him, and by extension, we can deploy that same power by repeating his words. It's an empowering idea, suggesting that we have a specific verbal tool at our disposal to force the enemy to retreat. It fits a simple and satisfying model of conflict: their evil power versus our God-given verbal power. It turns the phrase into a kind of holy incantation, a ready-made weapon for every believer. But a closer, more careful reading of Jude's text, as some thoughtful observers in our community have pointed out, reveals a potential flaw in this interpretation. The verse doesn't just say Michael spoke the words. It says he did not dare to bring a slanderous accusation himself, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." Phrase, "did not dare," is the key that unlocks a second, far more profound meaning. Why would the commander of heaven's armies, a being of immense power standing before his sworn enemy, not dare to condemn him? This wasn't about fear. Michael did not fear Satan. It was about something more fundamental: divine order and jurisdiction. Michael understood his role in the cosmic hierarchy perfectly. He was a warrior, a guardian, a servant of the Most High. He was not a judge. The authority to condemn, to pass ultimate judgment, belongs to God alone. For Michael to have pronounced his own railing accusation, even a justified one, would have been an act of pride. It would have been a step, however small, towards the very same sin that caused Lucifer's fall in the first place, the sin of usurping a divine prerogative. So his statement was not an attack. It was an act of perfect submission to the divine chain of command. He was not wielding a weapon himself. He was stepping aside and acknowledging the only one in the universe who had the authority to act as judge. He was telling Satan, "Your legal case is not with me, a fellow created being. Your complaint is with the Creator. I will not pass sentence on you. He will." Do you see the staggering difference? The first interpretation places the power in the phrase we speak. The second, deeper interpretation places the power in the position we take, a position of absolute humility and total reliance on God's sovereignty. The first view is about us fighting with a divine tool. The second view is about recognizing that the judgment, and therefore the battle, is not ours to fight in the first place. It belongs to the Lord. This second interpretation aligns perfectly with the entire cosmic drama. Lucifer fell because he wanted to be like God and seize his authority. Michael stands firm precisely because he knows he is not God and acts in perfect submission to his authority. Michael's response was the ultimate rebuke to Lucifer's pride, not through a clash of power, but through a demonstration of perfect, unwavering obedience. This changes everything. If the ultimate weapon used in this legendary battle wasn't a power phrase, but an attitude of the heart, then what does that tell us about the nature of true spiritual strength? It suggests that the most powerful force in the universe isn't might or magic, but a quality our world often mistakes for weakness. It is the very quality that Lucifer despised and that Michael embodied. It is the sword of humility. We have established that Michael's ultimate weapon was not a power phrase, but a posture of the heart. He wielded the sword of humility. In our modern world, this idea seems completely backward. We are taught to be self-reliant, to project strength, to hustle, to manifest our own destiny. Humility is often equated with weakness, a lack of confidence, an obstacle to success. But in the spiritual realm, the physics are inverted. The laws are different. And what our world perceives as weakness is, in fact, the source of the greatest and most terrifying power. First, we must understand what true spiritual humility is. It is not about thinking less of yourself. It is about thinking of yourself less. It is not self-hatred or a lack of self-worth. It is, quite simply, an accurate assessment of reality. It is the clear and constant recognition that God is God, and we are not. Pride, the very sin that caused Lucifer's catastrophic fall, is a form of delusion. It is the creature attempting to take the Creator's place, the finite claiming to be infinite. Humility, therefore, is not just a gentle virtue. It is a return to sanity. It is a radical alignment with the truth of the cosmos, and in that alignment, there is unimaginable power. The Apostle James lays this out as a spiritual law, as fundamental as gravity in the physical world. He writes that God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Let that sink in. When we operate in pride, relying on our own strength, our own intellect, our own righteousness to fight our battles, we are not just fighting alone. We are, in a very real sense, fighting in a way that places the power of God in opposition to us. We are rowing against the current of the universe. But when we operate in humility, when we finally admit our own insufficiency and turn to Him, we open a channel for His unmerited favor, His grace, His power to flow into our situation. We stop rowing and let the current carry us. This is why humility is both a suit of armor and a weapon. It is armor because it protects us from Satan's favorite and most effective tactic, temptation to pride. He wants us to believe we can handle our problems on our own, that we are strong enough, smart enough. Humility is the shield that deflects this fundamental lie, but it is also a weapon, because in emptying ourselves of our own ego, we make room for God's power to fill us. We become a vessel. The humble warrior is the most dangerous warrior on any battlefield, not because of their own skill, but because they have become a conduit for the infinite power of the Almighty. Satan knows how to fight a proud human. He has no idea how to fight God Himself moving through a humble human. We see this principle perfectly displayed in the life of Christ, who, as the Apostle Paul wrote in Philippians, emptied himself and took the form of a servant. His ultimate victory over sin and death was achieved not through a blinding display of divine might, but through the ultimate act of humble sacrifice. And we see it in the life of Moses, the very man at the center of this cosmic dispute, who was described in the book of Numbers as the most humble man on the face of the earth. His incredible power and intimacy with God were not in spite of his humility. They were a direct result of it. This principle is the bedrock of spiritual victory. But it's easy to talk about these grand cosmic principles. How do we apply this sword of humility to the messy, painful, and confusing battles we face every single day? How does this ancient secret change the way we confront fear, addiction, and despair in our own lives? The answer lies in translating this heavenly strategy into an earthly practice. The sword of humility is the principle. But a principle remains an abstract idea until it is applied on the battlefield of real life. So how do we bring this cosmic lesson down from the lonely valley in Moab and into the messy, painful reality of our daily lives? We are not archangels fighting over the bodies of ancient prophets. We are fighting quiet, desperate wars in our own homes, in our own minds, often in complete silence. It is the battle against a crippling addiction that whispers your name in the lonely hours of the night, promising a comfort that you know is a lie. It is the struggle with a spirit of fear that paralyzes your future and suffocates your faith. It is the fight to forgive a wound so deep, inflicted by someone so close, that the bitterness feels like a part of your own heart. In these moments, our natural, human, prideful instinct is to fight back with our own strength. We grit our teeth and rely on sheer willpower. I will be stronger this time, we tell ourselves after a relapse. We fight anger with more anger, replaying arguments in our minds and building cases against those who hurt us. We try to outthink our anxiety, creating endless logical scenarios to prove to ourselves that everything will be okay. We are, in essence, trying to fight like Satan fights, with our own perceived strength, our own will, our own authority. And that is why we so often fail. We are bringing our finite willpower against an ancient spiritual force. We are fighting on the enemy's terms, in a battle of strength he is designed to win. But Michael's strategy shows us another way. The Michael principle is not a formula, but a process of strategic surrender. It begins with the most powerful and courageous first step a warrior can take: admitting, I cannot win this battle on my own. This is not an admission of defeat. It is a call for reinforcements. It is the humble, tactical decision to stop fighting a tank with a rifle and instead get on the radio to call in an airstrike from an all-powerful command. The next step is to correctly identify the true enemy. Your battle is not ultimately with a bottle of alcohol. It is with the spirit of addiction that holds you captive. Your war is not with the person who betrayed you. It is with the spirit of bitterness that is poisoning your soul. Once we identify the true foe, we apply the final, crucial step that Michael modeled for us. Instead of standing up in our own spiritual authority and declaring, I rebuke you, addiction. We follow his example. We take a posture of humility and defer to the ultimate authority in the universe. The prayer changes. It becomes, Lord, this battle is yours. This spirit of addiction is too strong for me. I place it and myself entirely under your supreme authority. In the name of Jesus, who has all authority in heaven and on earth, I declare that the Lord rebukes this spirit of addiction. It is a profound shift from self-reliance to God-reliance. This is where speaking God's word becomes truly powerful. It is no longer about reciting magic words in our own strength. It is about aligning our reality with God's declared truth. When fear attacks, we align ourselves with the truth of 2 Timothy 1:7, declaring that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. We are reminding ourselves and the entire spiritual realm of the truth that trumps the enemy's lie. We are fighting from a position of victory, not for it. This strategy is how every spiritual battle is truly won. But this entire pattern is ultimately a reflection, a faint echo of the single greatest victory in the history of the cosmos. To fully grasp our authority, we must now look to the moment when our champion faced the accuser not over a prophet's body, but over the fate of all humanity. This strategy of humble reliance on divine authority is the key. It is how Michael secured the body of Moses, and it is the timeless principle by which we can find victory in our own daily struggles. But this entire pattern, this model of a servant warrior deferring to a higher power, is ultimately a shadow, a faint echo of the single greatest confrontation in the history of the cosmos. All of these smaller battles throughout history, from the valley in Moab to the battles in your own heart, were pointing toward one definitive war and one ultimate victor. That victor is Jesus Christ. He entered the battlefield of human history not merely as an archangel, a powerful servant of God, but as God himself in human form. And his battle strategy was the most paradoxical, unexpected, and brilliant of all. It looked nothing like what the world or the enemy anticipated. He did not come with legions of angels or fire from heaven. He came as a humble servant, born in obscurity. And his moment of greatest triumph looked, to all outward appearances, like his moment of most humiliating defeat: the cross. As Jesus hung on that cross, broken and bleeding, Lucifer must have believed he had finally won. He had successfully used his influence to incite humanity to accuse and execute the Son of God. He was now watching the light of the world be extinguished. In his mind, he had thrown all the sin, all the darkness, all the legal accusations of humanity onto this one man, and the weight of it was crushing him. In that moment, Satan believed his legal claim over a sinful world was being proven beyond all doubt. But he was utterly blind to the divine reality of what was actually taking place on that hill. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Colossians, gives us a glimpse behind the spiritual curtain, revealing the cosmic transaction that occurred. He writes one of the most triumphant verses in all of Scripture. "And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross." Let's unpack the weight of those words. First, he disarmed them. What does it mean to disarm an enemy? It means you take away their primary weapon. What has always been Satan's primary weapon, the very one he tried to use against Moses and the one he uses against us every day? Accusation. Our sin. Our failures. On the cross, Jesus took all of that sin, all of those accusations, all of that guilt upon himself. By paying the divine penalty for them once and for all, he legally and eternally stripped Satan of his power to accuse believers before the throne of God. The prosecutor's case was thrown out of the Supreme Court of the universe. Forever. He has no more legal ground to stand on. Second, he made a public spectacle of them. The cross was intended by Rome to be an instrument of public shame. But in the spiritual realm, God turned it into Satan's parade of defeat. What looked like the death of a failed Messiah was actually the triumphal procession of the King of Kings, parading his conquered and disarmed enemies for all the heavens to see. Their greatest apparent victory was twisted into their most public and eternal humiliation. This is the ultimate source of our power. When we fight our battles with humility, when we defer to God's authority by saying, "The Lord rebuke you," we are not just appealing to a distant, abstract power. We are standing firmly on the finished, legal, historical victory of Jesus Christ at the cross. Our authority doesn't come from a magic phrase, it comes from a historical fact. The war has been won. The enemy has been disarmed. We are not fighting for victory. We are enforcing a victory that has already been secured. Our journey is now complete. We began with a single, cryptic verse, a fingerprint left at a crime scene. We followed that clue back through the corridors of history to unearth a lost record, the Assumption of Moses, a file that had been erased from the official collection. We stood in a cosmic courtroom and heard the devil's brilliant legal case, and we witnessed the Archangel's even more brilliant defense. Through this spiritual excavation, we have uncovered profound truths. We have seen that the enemy's greatest weapon is not always brute force, but legalistic accusation and the twisting of good things into idols. We have learned that true spiritual power is found not in our own strength or our own words, but in the radical humility that defers to God's ultimate authority. And finally, we have anchored our hope not in a secret strategy, but in the finished, historical, and absolute victory of Jesus Christ on the cross, who disarmed our accuser forever. The case of Moses' body is closed. Michael stands as the victorious defender, the perfect model of a warrior who wins by knowing his place within the divine order. But as one sealed file is closed, another, covered in even more dust, seems to fall from the shelf. For what if I told you this was not Michael's only recorded battle? What if other ancient traditions tell a different story? We've seen Michael in his victory, but have you ever heard the story of his one defeat? There are whispers in obscure texts of a time when the great Archangel faced a challenge so immense, an adversary so powerful, that he was brought to the very brink of destruction, requiring the direct intervention of God to be saved. Who could possibly corner the commander of heaven's armies? And what does this hidden story of angelic struggle teach us about the true scale of the cosmic war? The ultimate victory in Christ is secure, but the stories of the battles along the way are far from over. Our investigation must continue.